Shortly after spending Cloud Strife's first night in the Sector 7 slums in Midgar, Final Fantasy VII Remake players are met with a familiar tune. Playing out of a golden gramophone, the signature whistle of the classic Chocobo theme rings out, only this time, it's backed by thumping bass, hand claps, and liberal usage of the Chocobo Kwe soundbite that is a staple in recent games. At first, I didn't care much for the song. Sure, it was a humorous use of Chocobo cries, a sound effect that has endeared itself to the fanbase through repetition alone, but it wasn't long before I was purposely backtracking out of my way to hear more of the unorthodox record. This song is a banger, and that wouldn't be the last time I thought that through my 30-hour playthrough. There's a theme song for Beck and his bandits, Kachi's theme, and so many more that left me lingering in the middle of areas or at rest points just basking in the sound waves. The music of Final Fantasy VII was already great. When the game released in 1997, a chief point of praise was the soundtrack's deft ability to shift genres without missing a beat. Final Fantasy VII Remake synthesizes that trait into a near 200-track long OST that makes for one of the most cinematic and just generally pleasant gaming soundtracks of 2020. Why is that? Let's take a look at why the music of Final Fantasy VII Remake is so damn good. I should mention the story of Final Fantasy VII, which drives the music. It follows the ex-Private Army super soldier Cloud Strife taking arms with local eco-terrorist group Avalanche to protect the city of Midgar from the ills of the Shimmer Power Electric Company. Along the way, Cloud, his childhood friend Tifa, and Diet Mr. T. Barrett meet Aerith, a flower girl whose latent abilities become a major plot point for much of the narrative. Before I dive into the more unique tracks, I want to say that the Final Fantasy VII Remake soundtrack is phenomenal. For all the experimentation, the FFVII OST still manages to fit in the emotionally moving pieces that stir the story towards its ever-present plot. The piano on Tifa's theme is as peaceful as ever, a stark contrast to her power-packed fists. The main theme's string section provides a vibrant prelude to a story that plays out like a stage show, though I guess it would be Final Fantasy IX that really takes its theatrics literally. But a big part of why the soundtrack is such a success is how seamlessly it blends into the world around it. Like the game's cutscene transitions that smoothly swoop from fixed camera angles to player-controlled view in an instant, Final Fantasy VII Remake's soundtrack merges the various gameplay settings as well. Take Midnight Rendezvous, which plays when Cloud and Aerith take leave from Sector 5 to Wall Market. There is the intimacy of the scene, which ends with Cloud and Aerith sharing a moment and a high five, contrasting with the pair's introduction to the sinful Wall Market shortly thereafter. But even before that, the track slides naturally into Collapse Expressway, taking the area theme and progressing it into a more dynamic soundscape for Cloud and Aerith to whack monsters and bandits to. Wall Market got a similar touch-up, featuring a trio of themes to suit different areas of the city. You have the Chocobo Sam version, which bounces along to the banjo and a whistling melody. Then there's the down-tempo Madame Min version, which takes an Eastern turn, playing the melody with what I can only imagine is a shamisen. All of that stems from the original track, which sees Horn belt the melody as a fanfare, welcoming our protagonist to the city that never sleeps. Genre-wise, Final Fantasy VII is all over the place. The Oppressed, the theme song for Beck's Badasses, is a lazy reggae-adjacent tune that features the unmistakable rubbing of a güiro. Wow, I haven't said that since the 3rd grade. It's a fitting theme for a trio that lives off the grid and scavenge properties like burnt-out train cars. Then the battle version of the song, Do Recompense, turns the track into a stuttering EDM variant, complete with reverb effects and all. Though it's not the most exciting track of the bunch, I have to say one of my favorites is Avalanche's theme. It's a lockstep sort of ditty that would sound right at home in Final Fantasy XIII, and rightly so. It was composed by Masashi Hamauzu, who lent Square Enix his talents for the Nova Chrysalia trilogy. Speaking of composers, longtime series composers Nobuo Uematsu and Masashi Hamauzu teamed up with relative newcomer Mitsudo Suzuki to produce a song, aptly titled Hip Hop to Chocobo, and hundreds more for Final Fantasy VII's remade soundtrack. Though Uematsu is best known for his work on the classic Final Fantasy games, composing regal motifs like Edgar and Sabin's theme in Final Fantasy VI, he's equally recognized for his willingness to push the soundtrack past the point of repetition. Uematsu and Hamauzu's experimentation is for the best. Japanese role-playing games had a history of dressing up tired gameplay mechanics with rudimentary stories about saving the world or abolishing evil. Classic JRPGs were obsessed with fiefdoms, mages, and monsters. Subsequently, That meant composing soundtracks befitting 13th century European royalty. In the late 80s and 90s, Fire Emblem didn't sound too different from Dragon's Quest, which didn't stray far from Final Fantasy. Part of the similarities can be attributed to the limited sound chips at the time, but more likely it was the game's subjects and stories dictating what the music would sound like. For Square Enix, that trend changed in 1992 with the release of Final Fantasy V. Uematsu scored his 5th iteration of the Chocobo theme song with the lollygagging groove of Cuban music. Mambo de Chocobo, which featured steel drums and again the rubbing of a güiro, was effectively the series' first foray into in-house remixes, setting off a trend that speaks to the series' bigger goals for diversity. I've always praised Final Fantasy XIII, my personal favorite game in the series, for its inclusion of the character Saz Catchoy. Sporting an afro and dual-wielding pistols, Saz could easily have been a replica of Japanese media's all-too-stereotypical representation of black men. Instead, 13 gave us one of the game's most human and universally understood characters. Unlike the rest of the party, which features a stoic ex-soldier, not Cloud, a big dumb hero, a couple of fear-struck kids, and whatever you classify Fang, Saz was more or less average. He was a single dad who earned his living as a pilot. When Lightning was planning to take out every military official in her way, Saz cowered in fear, wishing to return to his normal, if uneventful life. Though Saz never identifies as black, his presence, like Barrett's in the original Final Fantasy VII, is loaded. On the one hand, Final Fantasy is supposed to take place in fictitious worlds, in which dwarves live under the surface of the earth and sentient pudding has taken over the moon. Race, at least as understood in reality, never really comes into play. On the other hand, the concept of diversity was at the forefront of producer Yoshinori Kitase's mind when conjuring up Final Fantasy VII Remake. In an interview with Esquire, Kitase said that the game's creators highlighted their own varied upbringings when creating the FF7 world. Doing so adds that exceptional and unique individuality in the shape of the characters, the lore, the visual presentation, color palettes, etc. that makes this franchise so different from others, especially compared to Western titles. Though critics and forum threads have called into question Barrett's brash and short-tempered representation of the remake, he was originally based off of TV personality and wrestler Mr. T. The wider world of FF7, known as Gaia, doesn't box its characters in so easily. The slums of Midgar are a melting pot, unidentifiably Japanese. It's unlike a series like Persona, which is explicitly Japanese, but it's also not a strictly Western world, like the Norse world of God of War or the parodied cities of Grand Theft Auto. Diversity in FF7 Remake is driven home by the game's soundtrack, which draws on original compositions of classic songs. Its genres aren't limited to rote orchestrations of classical music. Sometimes FF7 Remake channels haunted lullabies, as it does on the Train Graveyard track. Other times, the soundtrack stretched along with surf rock, with Electric the Chocobo, bossa nova on the Coastal Soul track, and jazz funk with Ketshi's theme. This variety brings Midgar to life. The soundtrack establishes the game's pacing, creates tension, and resolves crises as players work to understand the trials and tribulations of Cloud and his party. And, thanks to Midgar existing in a cyberpunk world that doesn't explicitly parody any real-life location, the OST is made even more fitting as the songs represent the game's world, and not some preconceived idea of what the world of Final Fantasy is supposed to be. I never asked for hip-hop music in Final Fantasy, but its inclusion is part of a broader message, which speaks to the growing importance of representation in video games. How do you relate to a diverse audience? Final Fantasy VII Remake is a cultural record exchange, normalizing ethnic diversity through song. The music of Final Fantasy VII is good not just because it touches on a variety of genres, but because it does so without undermining or pandering to the existence of any of the game's characters. Sure, Chocobo Sam is effectively a hillbilly, but he's also apparently capable of making high-tech killing machines to compete in Corneo's Coliseum. Yes, Barrett is a brash hothead who will wield his gun arm indiscriminately, but he's also a loving dad who'd go to the end of the world and back not just for his daughter, but for his friends. Like the game's music, Final Fantasy VII's characters are layered, and the soundtrack does a terrific job of telling their stories, one note at a time.